program called What's Going on FlintTalkRadio.com. I'm George Moss, the host of the program, and we are back after a 4 week hiatus. I was in Africa for 4 weeks, and we're now back, and we are doing the program here on Labor Day. And we are taping it live, meaning that we are not doing what we did for the last 4 weeks, which was to have programs in the can, so to speak, that would cover the time that I'll be away. I went to 4 countries while I was away from the studio, and I'll do a little bit of reporting on what went on over there. But basically, what I want to do today is talk about the article I just got through putting on Facebook, where I wrote about Labor Day. And I think I put some ideas out there that have not been written about before, and I'm going to try to share some of those ideas with you before we leave this afternoon. Anyway, we come to you again at 2 o'clock in the afternoon from 2 to 3. And you can tune us in right here at FlintTalkRadio.com live and pick us up anytime at your convenience based upon the fact that we do, in fact, store these programs on the network here at Flint's number one podcast program. As always, we're very glad to have you out there, and we're honored by the fact that you would tune us in and would help support what we do here. We are working very hard to not only earn your trust, but to keep the trust that we've already built up over the years in the program that we've been doing here. And we are going to continue to develop ourselves and improve the studio. And I'm looking around to see what else has been done since I was gone. This is my first time being in the studio over the last 3 or 4 weeks.
By the way, we'll also remind people, too, to check out Flint Talk Radio's website, because you are now joined by another voice, another black conservative, Ron Edwards.
Mm-hmm.
And his commentary, you can click on the link beside his picture, and you can go to some of his commentaries. We'll also be updating that as well. But those are mostly just audio. He doesn't have any video attached to him. But he has his own website, obviously. So, but he's out of the Royal Oak area. So he's and also within a week or so, we're definitely going to have an interview with you and he, talking about your shared views of conservatism and the better voice for African Americans in the United States. So,
yeah, he's well known. How did you make that contact, John? I'm just interested in how that developed.
Actually, I saw his agent, Laura, was posting stuff on Facebook, and and one guy suggested, "Why don't you contact Flint Talk Radio?" Well, I saw the conversation thread, so I contacted her directly, and she goes, "I thought it was a joke at first, because she goes, a lot of people don't want to listen to me, and." Take us up on. I said, well, we definitely are, because I said, and I said, we've had a black conservative on for several years now, and I said, and it's good to see another one cropping up in Michigan. I said, there's several in the area, I know that. I said, but, and she goes, well, yeah, she's out of New York, though, and she's very, she works fervently for him because she really believes in his message. He's a very common sense, a lot like you, very commonsensical, let's stop beating ourselves up for the past, let's move forward kind of a person, and I think there's a lot of common ground between you and he. So
yeah, I'm aware of him. I know on Facebook there's a post that he does called the Edwards Group, and it's a consortium of people all over the nation that are sharing these values that are in fact beginning to grow exponentially throughout the country. And black conservatives, and I am definitely a black conservative. Our numbers are in fact growing. There's no place for the liberals to go, because they've already done their best shot, so to speak. They've already fired their rockets, and they've landed in the wilderness of political thought. And we have now had a chance to look over the last 50 years at the culmination of what those ideas have led to, and we see the results of it. So that has been tried and proven not to be the way we need to be going, and now is our time, and we're going to take the bull by the horn, so to speak, and run with it, because the ideas that have been set in the past, going all the way back really to Booker T. Washington, and looking at the kinds of things that were happening there between the discussion that he had and that of W.B. Du Bois, we can now see that we went down the wrong alley, so to speak, once Du Bois's work had come to an end, basically because he had, at the end of his life in 1915. And then the other voice was out there that was left behind after the Wizard of Tuskegee had died, that voice of the up and coming W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP that had been founded in 1909. That was the voice that then took the reins of power, so to speak, the voice in the black community, and ran with it, and ran all the way down to the time of the Civil Rights Movement. Now that we have seen the end result of all the energy that was expelled out of the energy of the movement created in the aftermath of slavery, we're now seeing where it's led to, and it's now time to understand where we are and to take a different course, and that's what I think is happening. That's why I'm very happy that we were able to make contact here at the studio with people like Ron Edwards. I'm aware of his work, so I'm really glad that you made that contact over the time that I was out of the studio and out of the country, John.
Yeah, another thing is too is like I'm just a white guy looking at this too, but I grew up in the 60s, early 70s, and I went to school with blacks, and I saw the gradual withering away of the strong black community. I mean, I saw like more and more grandmothers become the parents of the children, their grandchildren. I saw more and more dysfunctionalism, more and more heavily dependent upon the welfare system, and so yeah, I'm outside of this. I'm seeing this, but I mean, I don't see how somebody could look at that. All these liberals, I don't see how these black activists who are liberal leaning can see the demise of a strong black community and a fragmentation and bitterness and this rage against one another that they're actually killing each other, and saying there's no intellectual honesty on their behalf, saying we helped cause this. Mm-hmm. Camille Paglia, she's a feminist, anti-feminist feminist, very radical on her beliefs back in the 60s. But when the AIDS developed and everything, and all these other diseases through the sexual revolution, offshoots of that, mm-hmm. Because it manifested, she actually said, you got to be honest enough to say what we advocated led to this. Yeah. You got to take responsibility. You got to own mm-hmm. that. And I don't see this ownership going on for that, for what the decay they've caused. Mm-hmm. They're just a total dismissal. It just falls in deaf ears. You mm-hmm. bring it up. They always want to shift the. It's basically we did this because you did this or they did that.
Right.
They can't say, well, I didn't do what I could have done. Mm-hmm. They don't say that.
Well, they're not going to get an apology, because if they apologize for having gone down the wrong road and carried the whole community and even the country down that road, then it would lose all credibility. So we can forget about anyone saying, oops, that was a mistake. And certainly it does not play well in the political arena, where we can go back and trace where the breakdown occurred. That's why they have to go back and try to make believe, and that's what you were alluding to, was this fantasy that's been created, that they go back and do this make believe that it starts back with slavery, rather than the breakdown that we can see that really can be traced back to the 1960s. And we see that in terms of the family structure. And we see it in terms of a lot of other things that have happened in the community, where the violence began to grow exponentially, and we see all the things that have happened that are all of these negative indicators, and we can see what has led to that, and that's these liberal policies that nobody wants to, on the left, admit that that's where the breakdown occurred. And we have all these lies that are put out here as a way of covering up what really happened, because it cannot be attributed to slavery if you look at the fact that the families were pretty much two-parent household families. Moynihan was actually writing about it as late as 1965, when he said that the breakdown was at that point 25%. I mean, when I say breakdown, I mean 25% of the children at that point were born out of wedlock, and now we have 75% of the children born out of wedlock. So you look in the more recent past, and you see that the breakdown that we're now experiencing had come on the other side of the 1960s, and we now have it at the point where there was 75%, 3 out of 4 black children are born out of wedlock in the United States. I was in Africa, as I said, I visited 4 countries, and I was in some of the most poverty-stricken areas I've ever seen. I was in Senegal, I was in Gambia, Central African Republic. I don't know why I went over there. And I was in the Cameroon. And I had to go to countries that I could get back into Gambia from, because because of the Ebola, they were restricting your travel in Africa. So some countries I had put on my itinerary to visit, I had to take them off, because I couldn't go into certain places for fear of not being able to get back into the areas that were now the restricted zones, because they were not allowing anyone to deplane in those areas where the Ebola breakout had occurred. And when I was there, it had occurred in really 3 countries, but Nigeria had a case of it as well, and therefore they added them as a 4th country where they had this problem. So I had to then go, I was going to go to Sierra Leone, but I had to go to other countries and strike Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea-Conakry, as opposed to Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Conakry off my itinerary because of the Ebola breakout. And in Nigeria, I was going to go there a couple of days, but a person that was from the United States, I understand, had gone to Liberia to see after his sister and didn't know that she had contracted Ebola. He didn't know she was sick, but he didn't know the nature of the sickness. And having been in that environment, that contagious environment, without any kind of protection, he contracted the disease, got on the airplane, and then went to Lagos in Nigeria and died there. Now they got a problem in Nigeria, which wasn't contracted through the indigenous population, but it was contracted through a person that had traveled there. And then they were put under quarantine. And I have to give the African leadership, the members of the government leaders in Africa credit for having taken certain measures to restrict the areas which were affected so that it would not become an epidemic throughout the continent and affect a much larger region. I mean, so far, there was no panic on the continent, and it has affected about 3,000 persons, of which there have been about 1,400 to 1,500 deaths that have occurred. And I'm not buying that anyone has come up with a serum. You know, they were trying to make it seem like there was a secret serum that had been developed in Atlanta by the CDC or some other by WHO or somebody, the World Health Organization, and that they had developed some kind of antidote to Ebola, which really is nonsense. That's not what resolved the problem. In the 2 cases that came back here to the United States, the disease Ebola, the first outbreak of Ebola we saw was in 1976, I believe it was, in the Congo. It gets its name from the Ebola River in the Congo, and they had it for the same reason that you have one strain of the HIV virus, which is the infectation of the monkey population, the chimpanzee, the orangutans, maybe the gorillas in Africa. And the reason why they're so contagious for human beings is because the genetic root of humans and chimpanzees and monkeys and so on is so similar. We only differ in about 3.5% of our genes. So our genetic structure is pretty similar, but because we're human beings, we differ to a extent, of course, from that species, and so therefore, given the close of our genetic structure between the humans and the chimpanzees and the monkeys and so on, that anything that they get, and we eat that meat called bush meat, then we'll get that as well, and that's where Ebola it comes from. All countries have bush meat. I mean, we have bush meat here, the deer, but if deer are infected with a disease, we're not likely to get it as much because the differential in the genetic structure of the animals here and the ones that in our human nature. But in Africa, there's a different bush meat that is eaten, and in those places where that bush meat was eaten, in those places, Ebola then was the result of it.
Because it jumps to the species barrier, I think, because the more likely it has a possibility of happening, the more you have something genetically similar to that species originally found in. So
that's the cause of it.
Yeah, so it's like that's. I was wondering where Ebola came from because I've never heard of it any other place other than Africa. And
yeah.
But it's like, is it a parasite or is it airborne or what is it?
It's not airborne. There's one other strain of it in the Philippines. but it's not the same strain, and nobody's died from it in the Philippines, so you don't hear about it over there. And really, the number of persons affected by it in Africa has been very much restricted. There are 500 million people below the Sahara Desert in Africa, made up of 48 different countries. And of that number, 4 countries have been affected to certain places in those countries, not even throughout the countries of those 4 nations, but in certain areas, pretty much in the coastal areas, where you have it. And if you look at the map, you'll see that it's pretty much just on that west coast, where you have Sierra Leone. What you really have is you have Senegal. Senegal surrounds Gambia, and then next to Senegal you have above you Sierra Leone. Then you have Guinea, Conakry. Then you have Liberia below that, and then you have Guinea-Bissau. So when you look at those countries that were affected, you see they are very much in the same area, and you can go by land from one to the other. So that would be why there's a problem one after the other there. It only became a problem in Senegal. As a matter of fact, when I came back, I saw a case where they'd had one case of Ebola in Senegal. Didn't have it when I was there in Dakar. But I think that came from the fact that they came across a land which can travel across the land. They wouldn't have allowed anybody to come by plane. And those that came from those infected countries by plane to places like Gambia and Senegal, they sent them back. They would not let them get off the plane, stop them at the airport, and had to get back on the plane and go back to where they had originated from. And there were no flights out of places like Nigeria, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea-Conakry. They would not let them out of those. They would not let them come from those places into areas not affected. So that's why you've not seen the spread. And there was no panic. I went to different countries that had not contracted the Ebola, and I didn't see any panic anywhere in Africa. And they had to, in fact, take responsible action against it, because if the word gets out that these areas that rely so much on tourism are affected, then that almost destroys those economies that are dependent, particularly this time of the year, upon the tourist trade. Because tourism in West Africa, for example, in Gambia, which I know better than I do the others, since that's always my stopping off point, my jumping off point in Africa, since it's such a safe country. I always start off there, and I try to figure out my itinerary once I get there. But in Gambia, the tourist season starts, I think it starts really October the 15th, but they tell you there that it starts on the 15th of November, and it goes on for the next 6 months until April the 15th, around that time period. And they have a lot of people come there because they go there because of the weather, and they also go there because there is almost zero crime in Gambia. I mean, I'm walking the streets in Gambia at night, going in what would be called alleys here, but streets there that are not paved, but you would call it an alley if you base it upon how we look at what alleys are here in this country. And you go in there, there are no lights in the alleys. You can't even see the persons approaching you or the ones in back of you until they get right up on you. And you're not looking over your shoulder because there's absolutely no threat that anybody's going to do anything. And I'm talking about the fact that I'm identified as a tourist. Of course, they know me pretty much in Gambia. And so I have a certain camaraderie out there. Because, in fact, when I told them that this may be my last time on the continent of Africa, as I have to go and visit some other places right now that I have in my sights to go and visit, one of which, by the way, is a place I heard about when I was over there, South Korea. And I was told so many wonderful things about that place that that's 2016, I think I'll be in South Korea. But next year I'll be in Europe, because I want to see the museums both in London and also in Paris. But just the fact that, and I would say to say this to my friends, that this may be the last time that I'll be on the African continent. And they didn't take that too well, because we've developed over the last 8 years, starting in 2007, a very close relationship. And when I walk down the streets in Gambia, I'm recognized fairly widely in Banjul and Seneca and those places. So if I'm walking in the streets, I'm going to be recognized pretty widely in those places, particularly by those who have been my drivers in the past.
Well, you're an Igbo chief.
And in Nigeria, if I go there in Owerri, I'll be recognized widely there because I was made Igbo chief in 2009. So that's just. I'm sad to be thinking about that. I won't be going back there at least anytime soon, but I'll always have Africa in my heart because I've seen things that have really awakened me to a lot of understandings I would not have had if I had not gone there. One of which is I can see very clearly that poverty does not drive crime, because if that were the case, we would have seen crime all over the place in Gambia, because I saw poverty is unparalleled in this country. In fact, we'll be calling poverty here. What is poverty here? Poverty here is everybody having only one TV set in a household, possibly one computer, air conditioning maybe in one room rather than all the rooms, maybe not having a microwave oven. I mean, that's poverty here. But when I'm talking about poverty over there, I'm talking about people that are fighting in order to get a bag of rice, which would last for a month to feed their children. And that's what I did, by the way, in terms of every country I went into. I made it a point to go to they have these stores in the alleys, and I made it a point to go around wherever I was staying, and I would wait until the children would see me, and when they would show up, I would then, the store would have bread. Bread is very important in Africa. And when they say man doesn't live by bread alone, well, in Africa that's true in the material sense, because they also live by rice. I'm not talking about the spiritual dimension of that statement, but in the physical dimension of it, rice is also a very important staple. They don't eat bread for dinner. They have bread in the morning. The adults would have a typical breakfast would be bread and tea, and the bread would be would either be the wide kind, like you see maybe in the Subway sandwich, they make the sandwiches out of in Subway. And there's another kind of long type of bread they have, not the sliced bread we have here, but a long type of bread. And they sell that bread for about 6 cents. That's very important in the staple in Africa, because they can eat bread in the morning. They can at least they wouldn't have the nutrition, but at least they'd have something that fills them up. And what I made it a point to do, everywhere I went, I would buy bread for the children. Sometimes I'd have 20 some odd children waiting on me. And when I turned that corner, those little children would run, and they just almost run into you, and then hug you around your waist, and then one child on this side, one child on that side. They knew where the store was located, and they would pull you to, not pull you, but walk with you, holding your hand as you walk to the store. And I would always tell them at the very beginning of buying bread, I would say, you don't have to push, and you don't have to extend your hand. Everybody's going to get bread. And once they were assured of that, maybe on the second day that everybody's going to get bread and nobody's going to be left out, then there was no shoving, and they were willing to line up, knowing that I wouldn't leave until, we would, do the count and then order the bread, which you put on the counter, and we would pass it out to all the children. There was one little guy, though. There was one little guy in the Central African Republic that had been given bread. He put the bread behind his back. I consider him to be a future politician, but he put the bread behind his back and tried to get another. I would say it's not. I wouldn't say loaf of bread, but another. One of those pieces of bread they sell. And what I did when I saw him do that, I made him all the following days get in the back of the line. I really told him not to come back, but I couldn't keep the child from having bread. So when he came back the next day, first of all, I brought him to the front, and I told him to apologize to all of the ones who were out there whose bread that he had really tried to steal. Not that they would not have gotten bread, but the fact he was trying to get their share of what was really being offered. I want him to apologize, and some of the children said, well, he doesn't speak English. So one thing he did understand, we pointed to the back of the line. I made him get in the back of the line every day. But even he, at the end, when I was telling him that's my last day being in that country, even he came up there and hugged me as I was leaving. What you really get from Africa that is so moving is that anything you can do for them, they're so appreciative of it. They don't take anything for granted, and anything you do, you can feel the gratitude. And I have to say this too because I want to talk about Labor Day. I have some things I want to say about today's celebration, because I want to put that into a context that's different from what is happening in terms of other writings about it. And I want to bring another viewpoint to that conversation. But I will say, in being in those places, what you notice is that and I'll tie this in with Labor Day here. You'll notice that a lot of people are driving taxi. Now, you can hire the taxi and be in a taxi by yourself. You'll pay a higher amount for it because you're actually renting that taxi, to the exclusion of all the others. And there are certain drivers who drive just for that part of the population. Basically, though, it's for the tourists and those that don't want to ride with the indigenous population because you want your own private car. You can do that, but you're going to pay a higher cost. And sometimes I would be on my cheap days, and I would hire in what's called bush taxi, meaning that you're riding in the taxi with everybody else. And what they do there is that they pick the riders up, and wherever the rider's being dropped off, they get out and some other person get in. They're constantly exchanging riders, but you're paying only a certain amount, very cheap price, because you are riding with everybody. Now, you don't have the taxi to yourself. They call it bush taxi. And I would feel guilty about that because here I am riding at the bush taxi rate, and I have money, and these people are driving those taxis that where they're trying to feed their families. I mean, they're driving those taxis all day long. Well, the other taxi, the one that is really for those that can afford to rent the taxi for a particular tourist, they don't drive up and down the streets. They simply park their taxi. If you have their number, you can call them and you can get them to come and pick you up. Or if you're walking, they'll see you and you can get in that taxi, which would be the one you have to yourself. But I kind of felt guilty about that because I'm thinking to myself, these people out here driving these taxis, I'm in here trying to save a couple of cifas, which is the currency in the Cameroon. And when I was in Sierra Leone, the Sierra Leone currency, they call it Sierra Leone, here I'm paying this rate when I have the money as a tourist to pay the other person who, if he doesn't get in the riders, he doesn't have the food for his family for the next day. So I only did the bush taxi, I think, twice while I was in Africa. I would rent from the driver, who otherwise wouldn't have any riders because the native population can't afford to rent his service, can't afford to contract his service because they wouldn't have the amount of currency it would take to ride the taxi by themselves. So I would make sure that I was diversifying, I was redistributing the wealth, which no politician I was able to do it for myself, and no politician telling me that they can redistribute my money without my permission, and that would be legal. I was redistributing the wealth. I wasn't redistributing. I was distributing the wealth by determining that this driver will have that person a day, and this driver the next day. And they would tell me, and when I would pay them a little bit more than what the service is really about, they would say, you get things like, I'm very happy. I'm very happy. And you get that kind of response. And, you feel pretty good about having, fed a family. And I'm going to come back here and do some things that will further that kind of a possibility, because I came back with some ideas of how we can do some real service along that line without going through these agencies where the money is eaten up through bureaucratic expenses. I have some routes that I brought back. We can do some things as a group here in this country, because America really wants to do some things to help the people in the so-called third world. And I was doing some things, but I know that America is that kind of country. And so I know that what I was doing on a very small base, I know a lot of people want to join in and try to do something, given the kind of country that we live in. And so I have some ideas how we can do that in terms of some things I brought back to work on over here on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. But over there, I was very glad to be able to do things on a small basis that didn't break me, but at the same time allowed me to spread a little bit of cheer around so that people could do what to them is important, which is to make sure their family had rice and that their family had bread the next morning and things like that, which is very important to them, where saving is pretty much not even a possibility, given that they're living from, as we would say over here, hand to mouth, or living from day to day because they don't have enough capital saved up in order to do things as we do here, in terms of get our check and have enough left over to put some money aside for a rainy day. Every day it rains. It rains over there, and every day is a struggle for the bread and a struggle to have enough money left over for the rice and things like that. So that was something that really you bring back to say, okay, I'm back now, so what can I continue to do along those lines? I have some ideas about it, and we're going to try to implement some of those ideas over the long run. But I'm just making the point, which I said I was going to tie it into Labor Day. I am going to tie it into Labor Day. I'm making the point that over there is tremendous poverty, but there's also a tremendous amount of humanity that you see in terms of nobody is over there trying to hit you in your head and take your money from you or to exploit you, although they know that you're a tourist because the physicality is different. And I'm reminded of that every time I go into Africa of how this generic term we use over here, African American, is such a misnomer, because you see the diversity in Africa, and the term African American is an overarching definition of an identity, which would imply that there is congruency in Africa, so that there's just a single people there, because we're looking at the complexion and not looking at the complexity of the groups that live there. And I saw that, as a matter of fact, when I was among the Mandinka, which is an offshoot of the Mandingo people that comes out of the Mali Empire, which was the second great empire in West Africa. And the Mandingo, Mandingo, they have different branches of the Mandingo group. I was with the group called the Mandinka, and I never understood until I was really among them and was sitting with them in discussions and things of that sort over the time that I was there, that the Mandinka make a distinction between themselves and the Mandingo because of the difference in the dialect based upon the colonizing agent in the two areas. And in fact, they even consider themselves to be different from the Mandinka in Guinea, I think in Guinea Conakry. I think they're more. I think they feel more of an affinity toward the Mandinka in Guinea-Bissau. I think I have it right. That I know it's Guinea, but I think it's Guinea-Bissau. They felt more of an affinity to, and it's because they make a distinction between the Mandinka that will be in Guinea Conakry, and then the Mandinka in Guinea-Bissau, because of the difference in the dialect between the two. And they were telling me we can't understand too well the Mandinka in one of the other of those two countries, and so therefore they don't feel as much of an affinity for the Mandinka, whose dialect is different, although they spring from the same Malian Mandingo tree. And then that you can see then the problem that you have in trying to have this and having this overarching concept as an African American, as if there is such a generic use that can be made of a continent that's probably one of the, if not the most diverse continent in the world. I mean, there are 2,000 languages in Africa. I mean, languages and dialects in Africa. So you're not talking about a single political, cultural, economic unity. You're talking about diversity magnified in terms of what you run into. And I think only ran into one person that would accept the admonition of African American, because most of them would see it as you're Black American. Now, let me try to tie some of this into Labor Day, which is really what I want to talk about, at least a little of the conversation today about this memorable occasion. And that is, what I noticed in Africa is that wherever there was an absence of the entrepreneurial class that's under attack in America today, and really attacked all over the world, because they have Labor Day in many parts of the world, although not all of them are celebrated on the first Monday in September as it is in the United States and Canada. A lot of them have it on different days. Some of them have it in May, for example, which really would have been the day that makes more sense in the United States, which would have been in some regards to what occurred on May the 4th, 1886 in Chicago in the Haymarket, what they call the Haymarket Massacre. But I think that what Grover Cleveland was doing in 1894, when they made it a federal holiday, I think what Grover Cleveland was trying to do was to separate it from some of the socialist roots that this holiday really has, based upon what else was going on. And I wrote about that in my post today, which I'm going to tell you about that in just a minute, about what I think we need to be looking at that's underneath the radar of what this celebration really is about, because there's more going on here than meets the eye, which I was not aware of. And so I began to really think about it just looking at, having read some other books while I was over in Africa and thinking about this, I began to come up with some different conclusions about it, which I don't think anybody else has drawn. But there are some things we need to say about this holiday that's not being said. But when I was in Africa, what I did notice is that wherever there was an absence of this class, an absence of the group of which Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and all these people that helped to get the industrial development in this country off the ground, wherever there has been an absence of that class of people, what you see is the tremendous poverty in those countries where that class either does not exist or has not been allowed to exist in the first place. Maybe it existed at one time and has been killed off. The goose that laid the golden egg has been killed off by the political class that wants the influence that class would have just because they are the producers. And they are no longer allowed to exist by those who have replaced them because of the envy, the coveting of the role they play, which I see it happening here, and where that class never did materialize in the first place, which is in a lot of parts of Africa, then you see the poverty that is a result of it. And even in America, when you think about it, is that you think about how this country was able to do so much along the lines of creating wealth because of that class, and look at what has happened now that class has been removed from being able to be the custodians of the economy. I mean, the way they do it here is a little bit different than they do it in terms of the socialist states. we don't have socialism in America. We have fascism. And what they do there is that they have, what the politicians have done is that they don't take over the economy. What they do is they simply regulate it from outside so they can have deniability of who is actually running it. So if their policies do not work out, they can always call to Washington the people that's out there directly in the running the businesses and blame them for whatever occurs that has not worked out. But they're the ones that's actually making up what the do's and don'ts are, or what they can and cannot do.
Like, that goes along with the tax code. They always go on about the politician. It's unfair these people get away these tax loopholes. The same people who are saying that are the ones who wrote the tax code.
Exactly.
And Barney Frank, for example. I mean, all these guys have been around long enough to actually have a crucial role in formulating tax policy. Yet I call them like they're basically the ones that go, hey, who did that, man? Who's doing that? Who's stealing from you? Oh, yeah, it's those guys. We're not going to say, well, we held the door open for them.
Yeah. John, it's amazing to me when I go back and look at the history. And I'm reading books now that are more outside of the mainstream. People like Dr. Thomas Woods, associated with the Mises Institute, so I like him already, or Charles Adams and Thomas De Lorenzo and people like that. I'm reading them now. And one book I read in Africa that was really quite eye-opening was the book written by Woods called The Political Incorrect Guide to American History. And what I got from it wasn't something he was pointing out directly, but what I was getting from reading it, I could see how the politicians have very carefully hidden their hand, hidden their role. And I'll be having a discussion today about that with one of my friends meeting me at one of the restaurants today, and I have to argue with him today. I know why he wanted to meet. He hadn't had a chance to argue with me for 4 weeks, but I'll be arguing with him about the Illuminati argument he always brings up about that, and the bankers, and I'm going to have even more ammunition after having read Thomas Woods' book, because I think what that is about is just more blaming of the capitalists the bankers. The argument I have is I have never seen anyone hold anyone up and make them do something based upon money. I mean not through force. I mean through greed, yes, but not through force.
But see, I think, as I like to point out too, another thing is politicians are responsible for the financial collapse because they're the ones that push for a centralized bank, which our founding fathers opposed. I mean, Jefferson saw that more of a threat to liberty than a standing military. So these people who keep on saying, well, we got to tighten the reins. It's the reason why, basically, you're giving them one clearinghouse for transactions because they control the monetary source and all that. You're making this system fail. I mean, right after they adopted the Federal Reserve System is when we had our first large-scale financial collapse within a few years.
I will tell you this, John, which I'm not telling you anything new, but I would say that is a mistake that Griffin makes in his book called The Creatures of Jekyll Island. Griffin's scholarship is impeccable. Now he's not an academic. He's not an academe. That is to say, he hasn't had any affiliation at any university, but he's just an out-of-the-box thinker that did his own research. But the mistake he makes is that he says that the Federal Reserve is a creature of Jekyll Island. That's not true. The Federal Reserve obviously is in fact conjured up on Jekyll Island, but what he misses is that Washington, D.C., for example, when you have this humongous government of 2.1 million people, is not the creature of Philadelphia. That's not what they intended. What the framers intended was to have a small government limited by the enumeration of powers in Article 1, Section 8. But look at it right now. What Griffin misses is that which became the creature. Yeah, the idea was formulated on Jekyll Island, but that which was that became the creature was placed in the same hands as the government was placed in and so on. And now we have a creature not intended by the framers and a creature not intended by J.P. Morgan.
Did you ever see that series called The Men Who Built America on the History Channel? There's a depiction and it's a depiction, but if you look at the history of the Morgan family, Julius is talking to Pierpont. He goes, careful, Pierpont, be careful where our loyalties lie. Their loyalties were to the Rothschilds, to the Bank of England, the Bank of Rothschilds. Mm-hmm. And so, people want to say that's conspiracy. That's fact. Mm-hmm. They started the centralized bank because of basically the pushing of European interest.
Yeah, the person that is the genesis of the idea of a centralized bank in the United States was Alexander Hamilton. And there's a reason why Hamilton, who was a big government person that didn't like the idea that power would be limited and government would therefore be limited also. Alexander Hamilton was a big government figure, unlike Thomas Jefferson and some of the others that were, for limiting government outreach, which they did that by, in fact, limiting the purse strings of the government. That's why you had no taxation upon income until 1913 with passage of the 16th Amendment. The framers were doing all kinds of things to restrain government's access to the purse, because if they don't have the money, they cannot grow into this monstrosity that we're looking at right now. And they did that by not only limiting power, enumerating it, what they could and could not do, saying that power is not delegated to the federal government expressly, would therefore fall to the people or to the states of the people they're in, and just putting all kinds of restrictions on it, limiting power both horizontally, where you had power divided and dispersed on the federal level, and then between the federal government and the states, putting some power in the hands of the people and its representatives in the House of Representatives, and then other power among the states' representatives in the Senate. And they simply would try to do everything they could to restrain what they had created from getting out of control. In other words, from it turning into a monster, because potential is always there when you put power in the hands of politicians. I think that's what Griffin misses in terms of how he sees it. That's not what was intended by J.P. Morgan. Morgan was actually responding to a real crisis that had occurred in 1907. And 3 years later, being a capitalist, he would have been remiss in his capitalist responsibilities to his stockholders if he had had a downturn in the economy and then took no action against it. And that's what they're meeting about there. But look at the person, Aldrich, who was there as a single politician. What Griffin did, by the way, I think, and I would like to have a conversation with Griffin about this, I think what Griffin did is he saw all these banking interests around a single politician, which was Aldrich, Senator Aldrich, that was there. And you think because of the number of bankers that were there, they had to be overwhelming Aldrich in order to bring about this, what he says later on was a creature that was created. By the way, 6 months after the quote-unquote creature of Jekyll Island had been conjured up and was pretty much on paper before it was actually put into, when it was actually created 3 years later, because they met it in 1910, and on the island off of the Georgia coast, they didn't actually create and set this up until 3 years later under the auspices of the government, which now claims it has no control over a unit that it created. If you believe that, then you really, this is independent of the government, and they have no control over what it does. That's what they're pushing, and I think Griffin buys that they are only beholden to their stockholders, and the independence is there, although the central bank has its headquarters under and is under control of a person that serves at the behest of the Senate, must be confirmed by the Senate being appointed by the president, and serves only 14 years. Try to get a senator to stand down after 14 years. Let's try to get McConnell to step down in November. Let's try to get him not to step down. Let's try to stand him down. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this idea that this monstrosity that we now have in the Federal Reserve was created on Jekyll Island is not true. Griffin did some impeccable scholarship, but I think his conclusion that what it turned out to be is attributable to people like J.P. Morgan, who is really the one that convened this conference. The fact is that 6 months after the meeting on Jekyll Island had occurred, I think it was 6 months after that had occurred, or 6 months after I think it was 6 months after it occurred, that J.P. Morgan died. It's either 6 months after that was over or 6 months after the founding of the Federal Reserve. So it is not even the monster at that point, even if it's 1913 that Morgan died, but I think he died in 1910. I have to go and check that. But I do know that what it turned into was not what has been given credit to J.P. Morgan as having caused, because he wasn't even around, as is now developing into something that was not intended based upon what happened at that point in time. What I was saying on my post today, and I think I pointed some things out that really, I think if you go back and look at it, you can see that it would be true based upon what occurred. I think that there's an unintended consequence even today of the celebration of Labor Day. I look at how it was created and pretty much out of what happened in Chicago at the Haymarket Affair. And I look at how how out of that energy, some of it was anarchistic in terms of some of the ones out there that had embedded themselves in the labor movement. Some of them were anarchists. I think August Spies is one such person that was one of the ones running the non-mainstream newspaper. And I think that his intent was something very different from what most of those persons out there were intending. There were some anarchists out there that were intending to radicalize the country, bring about capitalist overthrow, and set into motion what had been written by Karl Marx, but had not yet been put into place anywhere, and wouldn't be put into place anywhere on the earth until, in the entire universe, until it would happen under V.I. Lenin in 1917 in Russia. And he didn't know anything. And what he tried to do was an experiment that had failed by the time that he had died. But they were trying that back in the 1880s with the Haymarket affair. And they embedded themselves in it. Somebody in that group had thrown a bomb and were trying to show that the workers were being overwhelmed by these capitalists that would not give them what was their due, because they were paying them only $1.50 a day, and they're working 60 hours a week. And look at the oppression that was there according to what the going rate was. And when they wouldn't pay them more than that, then of course they were making the case that they were being exploited because of these capitalists that were in fact taking their labor and paying them nothing as a consequence of that. And I can understand how this writer right here would see that. This book came out in 1934 called The Robber Barons. I can see why this writer would see it as robber barons, because he doesn't understand why they were getting $1.50 a day and working 60 hours a week. It wasn't because of the robber barons. And Josephson couldn't even see this 28 years later when he wrote another introduction to the book in 1962. He was still seeing it through that lens in terms of these were robber barons, which he wasn't the first one to come up. They came up with the idea of that. The farmers came up with the idea, I think, in the 1880s, that they were robbing them of their labor and exploiting them and so on and so forth. None of that was true. You paid $1.50 a day under non-inflationary conditions, which we can look back at and say, well, look how much money they got. But they're being paid $1.50 a day because of the primitive aspects of production at that point. And it takes that number of hours a week to, which is not an 8-hour day, to produce the kind of things that keep the businessman open so that the businessman can have enough profit to maintain the business, which maintains the job, is paying that particular amount to maintain the workforce at that particular level in which the workforce is being paid. The problem that I think people have missed is that the workers and the capitalists did not have interests that were absolutely and 100% in congruency with each other, because one is trying to feed his family and one is trying to maintain keeping the business open. So although the interests converge, they don't converge absolutely and overlap each other, because one has interest in terms of maintaining the business, one is trying to feed his family. So there's different interests here. And they don't understand the capitalist interests, and the other persons don't understand why the workers can't understand the predicament he's in terms of how he needs profit in order to maintain the business, and you have a job here because the business is being kept open.
Well, the observation I made growing up here is everybody else is greedy. Okay, it's not the guy who's in the shop actually is greedy. It's the management and the higher ups in GM. They don't realize that. I mean, once these guys got into, like George McGovern, he got out of business. Politics, got into business, and it dawned on him, the idiot that he was. And, after all these years of hating the businessman, he was actually writing stuff that was pretty pernicious against the businessman, created draconian laws and stuff. He goes, "Gee, I was too hard on the businessman." And that's the big duh moment.
McGovern.
McGovern. It's like that's what it is. I mean, everybody, they don't see what they're up against. I mean, if it was like a private run company where you basically just had one family owning it and didn't have to answer million or thousands of stockbrokers, stockholders, you could do what you want. You could cut your own profit margin or your take. You could do that. When you're dealing with the corporate, and I can't understand the necessity of capital flowing in to this business to keep their jobs there.
That's it. That's what they were fighting for. But the workers can't see that interest because it doesn't absolutely overlap with the interests of the capitalist group. And they see them as exploiting them because here's what their pay is. But if they pay them the wages that goes beyond what their profit is, then the jobs that they're working at are in fact no longer there because they can't afford to keep the business open. And that's a contradiction that is that's a dilemma, I should say, not contradiction. It's a dilemma that's in place that the other side cannot see. I was writing today that when you look in primitive societies right now, where the same thing is going on, as when you see production going on in primitive societies, we may well see that, for example, in China, we may see that it as the workers being exploited, because over here the shoes, Michael Jordan shoes, are selling for $200 and some odd dollars a pair of shoes, and they'll say, well, look at the workers over there, they're making this, and then look at how much these shoes are selling for. I have to tell you something out there in the listenership. The exploitation is not those workers. The exploitation of the consumers in this country. And because it is exploitation of your stupidity. Because if they're making shoes over there for $10 and they're selling them for $300, it's not the workers over there being exploited, you're being exploited. Because you're the one paying that price. They're not exploiting the workers. In that environment there, those workers are making more money in those shops under those conditions that prevail over there that they can't make anywhere else. And that's why they're working in those shops. In other words, we have yet to understand what they were dealing with back there in the 1880s, where they could not give the 8-hour day. What makes 8-hour day, by the way, is not the unions that are actually asking for it. What happens in 8-hour day is innovations. When you put technology in place, you can now put the 8-hour day. Why would that be the case? Because in 8 hours, you can produce the same number of goods that when you didn't have the technology, it took 60 hours to produce that. So innovation is what really brought about the 8-hour day. But the unions get the credit for it. And I'm saying here that if it's unionization that causes that, and not the capitalist class that caused it, let's unionize over there where I was in those 4 countries in Africa. And let's see what the wealth would be if you take unions and place them over there, without that particular capitalist group over there to, in fact, create wealth. Because wealth is created by the capitalist group, without which you have what you have right now. And I want to say this and I'll be saying this in some future posts as well. I want to say this to those persons that's in Washington, that we have not yet come to grips, because they don't understand their own the psychological reasons behind what they're doing right now, because they don't understand the impulse that's been put in place by what occurred in the past, because it's now on automatic pilot, where they are attacking the capitalist class without understanding all of the psychological rudiments and the underpinnings of why it goes on, where the producers are being attacked in this country. It's just now, going on it's just automatically taking place right now by just doing things, thinking they have to hold the entrepreneurial class down. I would tell you that this country became the wealthiest country on the planet, creating wealth that was unparalleled in the history of the universe. And what has happened over the last, I'd say the last 30 to 50 years, really, let's say since the Roosevelt administration, although it was pretty much going down the road of doing that under Theodore Roosevelt and under Woodrow Wilson, and certainly under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we see that energy already unleashed, and it began to really take off under the Roosevelt administration. But look at where we are right now. This country was once the greatest, was the wealthiest country in the world, and today it has more debt than any country in the world, unparalleled. And how did that happen? Because we killed the golden goose that laid the golden egg. And we're now celebrating Labor Day, but we need to also bring into the celebration those who were the ones that made labor have a focus in terms of something to do with itself. And that would be the capitalist class. Okay, I didn't read my books. I'll read them next week. I want you to follow your dream, because until you do that, you will never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.